If you're an avid freeze dryer, you've probably gone through life freeze drying your fruits and vegetables and a lot of meat. But you're probably missing out on a very important ingredient that you probably haven't thought about much, and that is breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs is probably one of the most overlooked ingredients that you probably don't have in your freeze-dried inventory. But yet, breadcrumbs are one of the major ingredients if you're doing fried chicken, crab cakes, Wiener Schnitzel, onion rings, casseroles, meatloaf, shrimp scampi. You need breadcrumbs if you're going to survive the zombie apocalypse. And breadcrumbs are one of those things that is overlooked but are very important to have. Now, these breadcrumbs I have right here are breadcrumbs I've collected over the months and weeks that I've just kind of collected. And if you're like me, breadcrumbs come from those little things around the house that no one wants to have, like the end pieces of bread. No one likes the end pieces. And so you just kind of throw these to the side and you dry these out and you throw them into a food processor or into a blender and you grind them up. And then you kind of throw them into a Ziploc bag or something and you throw them into your freezer. Well, what I suggest you do is once you get a whole bunch of breadcrumbs like I have here, roll them into your freeze dryer and you go ahead and freeze dry them, and you'd be surprised how much moisture breadcrumbs will have. And because they do have moisture, they can actually rot and go bad if you don't freeze dry them. So I strongly suggest you consider freeze drying some breadcrumbs. Now in my household, my wife is gluten-free and I'm gluten-free by default. Now, if you know anything about gluten-free people, gluten-free bread is pretty expensive. And I have some gluten-free stuff that I've collected over the last little while. This is gluten-free bread right here, and I have to admit it's not the tastiest stuff around. And I have some gluten-free hamburger buns here, and you wouldn't believe it, but this tray right here of gluten-free bread and hamburger buns is about $10 worth of stuff. Gluten-free bakery goods is really expensive stuff, where if you look at a normal loaf of bread, it's probably maybe $2 or $3. And so if you're gluten-free, it's really important to preserve your end pieces and your other pieces of gluten-free bread to turn it into breadcrumbs, because that's really valuable stuff. Now, regular bread like this, you can just dry this out and grind it up into breadcrumbs really easy. But with gluten-free bread, it's a little bit different. And if you're gluten-free, you probably know what I'm talking about. If you let this stuff dry out and then you try grinding it up in a food processor or in a blender, this stuff is like rock hard and you don't get that really fine breadcrumb stuff. Well, if you haven't done this before, I'm going to show you a little bit of a tip on how to get really good gluten-free breadcrumbs out of gluten-free product. So I'm going to grab our blender and I'm going to show you what I do. Now this stuff right here is not quite dry. It still has a lot of moisture in it. So it's not quite to the point where it's rock hard, and that's where you want it. This still has some moisture in it, and that's what I want to do. I want to be able to put this through the blender while it still has some moisture, because once it's dried out, it's going to be like gravel. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in my blender a little bit at a time, and we're going to go ahead and grind this up. So all this is now ground up, but one thing you'll notice, it's quite moist still. So I'm just going to spread this out on a cookie sheet and put this aside for a day or two until this is all nice and dried out. And then I'm going to grind it up a second time. And that way, this will be really nice and fine that I can use in the future for my gluten-free cooking. So you have, with gluten-free baked goods, you kind of have to grind it up while it's still soft, because if you wait till it's hard, then it's almost hard as rock. This is all my gluten-free breadcrumbs that have been dried for about 2 days. Plus, I also pulled out a bunch of the gluten-free breadcrumbs that I have been accumulating in my freezer for the past several months. Now, it doesn't look much, but this amount of breadcrumbs is probably worth about $40 to $50 in gluten-free bread products that have gone bad or started to go bad that I caught just in time and dried out. And it may not seem a lot, but for those people who are gluten-free, this is a lot of money to let go to waste. And so that's one of the reasons why, if you happen to be gluten-free, it's really important to capture this product and turn it into breadcrumbs, and then to freeze dry it so you have it for future inventory and for future cooking. Now, if you're not gluten-free, regular bread, it's maybe $2 for a loaf of bread, which is not a big deal. But if you are gluten-free, this is a lot of money, and that's why I think it's important to capture this and not let it go to waste. Now, you may not be able to see this very well, but this is ground up pretty good. There's still some big chunks in here, so I'm going to grind this up one more time before I freeze dry it. So I have my mixer out, and we're going to go ahead and grind this one more time and get it a little bit more fine to use it in the future. Now, these breadcrumbs are really ground fine, and you can just feel that there's a lot of moisture in here, so that's one of the reasons why we need to freeze dry this. So I'm going to weigh these trays before and after to see how much moisture will actually come out. You'd be surprised how much moisture breadcrumbs that have been exposed to the atmosphere, exposed to just the air in my kitchen, how much moisture these breadcrumbs will suck in. And that moisture will just shorten the life of the breadcrumbs and actually make them not taste so appealing when it comes to cooking. So we're going to go ahead and weigh these, and then I'm going to pre-freeze these before I put them into my freeze dryer. Each tray of my breadcrumbs came out to 1,323 grams. I did this so they'd be the same amount of weight in both trays. That way they would dry at the same amount of time. I'm going to go ahead and put these in my freezer and pre-freeze them before I put them in my freeze dryer. At the end of freeze drying, we'll weigh them again to see how much moisture was removed. The breadcrumbs are out of the freeze dryer, and when we started we had 1,323 grams of breadcrumbs, and when we finished up we had 1,283 grams out of the freeze dryer. So altogether, in each tray, we lost 40 grams of water, which, to give you an idea, that's almost a quarter cup of water out of each tray. So that's quite a lot of water that came out of the breadcrumbs, and that's just the water that was absorbed from the air around the breadcrumbs as they were laying on my kitchen table drying. And it's kind of unusual to use the term drying, because as the breadcrumbs were actually drying on my kitchen table, they were actually also absorbing moisture. So you might want to give breadcrumbs a shot in your freeze dryer, because you'd be surprised how much moisture are actually in your breadcrumbs. So I'm going to take one of these trays, and I'm going to put this tray in Mylar bags for future use and add this to my freeze dry inventory. And the second tray, I'm going to put this into a Ziploc bag so I can use it for everyday use. And after a while, as I use these breadcrumbs, there's a good chance that moisture will creep into the bag and add moisture back in my breadcrumbs, but that's okay, because I can just take that bag of breadcrumbs and put it back into my freeze dryer. And the biggest notice you'll make between regular breadcrumbs and freeze-dried breadcrumbs is when you actually deep fry something. With the lack of moisture in the breadcrumbs, you'll get a lot less splashback when you submerge food into the deep fryer. Because of the less moisture in the breadcrumbs, the less splatter you'll have. But anyway, I hope you've learned something interesting on this little voyage of breadcrumbs that we had. So give it a try. Freeze dry your breadcrumbs and see what happens. But I'd like to thank you for your time. And as always, please subscribe to my channel and I will send another video your way. Go forth and freeze dry the world.